concerns.
I hope we don't go back to some of the practices in the past that, Harry and I had to grow up in. I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda.
Something huge just happened inside the palace walls, and the royal family will never be the same again. After years of trying to keep peace, Prince William has had enough and taken action that shocks the entire world. What made William finally snap after all this patience? Is there any chance these brothers will ever speak again? Join us as we dive into the most dramatic royal story of our generation. The final straw. Prince William sat alone at midnight in his private study, the weight of everything pressing down on his shoulders like a mountain he could no longer carry. For years he had tried to be patient, tried to be understanding, tried to be the bigger person while watching his family's dirty laundry aired on television screens and splashed across magazine covers around the world. The latest interview had been the breaking point, the moment when something inside William simply snapped like a branch under too much weight. His brother and sister-in-law had done it again, sitting on plush couches in their California mansion while telling their version of events to anyone who would listen, and millions of people were listening, hanging on every word, every carefully placed tear, every accusation wrapped in soft language but sharp as knives nonetheless. William had watched it with Catherine beside him, both of them silent as the minutes ticked by, both of them knowing that something fundamental had shifted and could never be put back together. He had called an emergency meeting for 1 o'clock in the morning because waiting until sunrise felt impossible, the anger and hurt and sheer exhaustion bubbling up inside him until he thought he might explode if he didn't take action immediately. His most trusted aides arrived looking rumpled and concerned, their eyes tired but alert as they settled into the leather chairs around the mahogany table that had witnessed countless royal decisions over the decades. William looked at each face in turn, these loyal servants of the crown who had stood by him through scandals and sorrows, and he knew they understood what was about to happen even before he opened his mouth. William declared with a steady voice that there would be no more chances, no more olive branches extended across the Atlantic only to be used as weapons against the very institution he would one day lead. The years of trying to maintain some semblance of family connection while being repeatedly hurt and betrayed had drained him of compassion, had turned his famous patience into something hard and unyielding like stone. The aides nodded and began taking notes as William outlined what needed to happen, the systematic dismantling of every remaining thread that still connected the Sussexes to the royal family beyond mere blood relation. There would be no going back from this, no future reconciliation that could undo what was about to be set in motion, and William accepted that reality with grim determination as the first light of dawn began creeping through the palace windows. The list of lost honors. The document began taking shape over the following 72 hours, each line carefully crafted by royal lawyers and palace secretaries who understood that every word would be scrutinized and analyzed and potentially challenged in courts, both legal and public. William reviewed each draft with meticulous attention, his red pen marking changes and additions as the list grew longer and more comprehensive than even he had initially imagined. What had started as a simple idea had blossomed into a complete accounting of every privilege, every honor, every symbolic connection that the Sussexes still maintained, despite living 6,000 miles away from the country they had left behind. First on the list came the Counselor of State Status, that ancient designation allowing certain senior royals to carry out official duties on behalf of the monarch when necessary, a role that required trust and presence and commitment to the institution above all else. The Sussexes had neither presence nor commitment anymore, William reasoned as he approved the removal. So why should they retain the theoretical power to represent the crown in any capacity whatsoever? The irony was not lost on him that they had fought so hard for freedom from royal duty, only to discover that freedom came with consequences they had not fully anticipated. Next came the patronages, those charitable organizations and military regiments and cultural institutions that had been granted the honor of royal association, some of which still technically listed the Sussexes as patrons, despite years of absence and neglect. William went through each one methodically, his pen striking through names and titles with firm strokes that felt both liberating and heartbreaking in equal measure. These organizations deserved patrons who actually showed up, who actually cared, who actually put in the work rather than using the association as a bullet point on a resume while living their best life in Californian sunshine. The military appointments proved the most painful to remove because William knew his brother had genuinely loved his time in service, had found purpose and identity in the structured world of armed forces, where rank mattered more than birth. But keeping someone as Captain General of the Royal Marines when they had not set foot in Britain for years made a mockery of the position, turned it into a hollow title with no meaning or substance behind it. The medals and honors would remain because they had been earned through actual service. But the ongoing appointments required ongoing commitment, and that commitment had been broken long ago. Then came the question of royal residences, the grace and favor homes that members of the family could use when visiting Britain, and William drew a line through those permissions with barely a moment's hesitation. Frogmore Cottage had already been returned, but there were other properties, other possibilities for accommodation that now became firmly off-limits, ensuring that any future visits would require hotels or private arrangements with no support from the institution they had rejected. Even the children's places in official succession protocols, while impossible to remove legally, would be stripped of any ceremonial recognition or expectation of participation in royal events should they ever visit the country of their heritage. Catherine's quiet counsel. For 3 days, Catherine had watched her husband pace the corridors of their home like a caged lion, had seen the tension in his shoulders growing tighter with each passing hour, had noticed the way he barely touched his dinner and spent long nights staring at documents that seemed to age him before her very eyes. The Princess of Wales had always been the calm one in their partnership, the steady hand that guided William away from rash decisions and toward measured responses that considered all angles and all consequences. She had spent years being the peacemaker, the one who suggested maybe one more chance, maybe one more attempt at understanding, maybe one more olive branch extended toward the brother and sister-in-law who seemed determined to burn every bridge they encountered. But even Catherine's legendary patience, the composure that had earned her respect from a nation that once viewed her as just a commoner who married well, had limits that were finally being tested beyond endurance. She had tried so hard to maintain some connection, had sent birthday gifts that went unacknowledged, had made phone calls that went unreturned, had suggested family gatherings that were rejected with increasingly transparent excuses. The final straw for Catherine had not been the interviews or the books or the documentaries that painted her family in ugly shades of dysfunction and prejudice, though those had certainly hurt more than she ever let show in public. No, what had broken something fundamental inside her had been watching her own children ask questions about their cousins they barely knew, seeing the confusion in George's eyes when he tried to understand why Uncle Harry never visited anymore, hearing Charlotte wonder aloud if she had done something wrong to make Auntie Meghan not love them. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the palace had grown quiet except for the distant footsteps of security guards making their rounds, Catherine found William in their private sitting room surrounded by papers and proposals and legal documents that represented the end of something that could never be repaired. She sat down beside him without a word, her hand finding his in that comfortable silence that came from years of partnership and understanding, and for a long moment neither of them spoke because words seemed inadequate for the grief they were both feeling. This was not the family either of them had wanted, not the future they had imagined when they had stood on that balcony years ago as newlyweds waving to crowds who believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Catherine had always believed in second chances, had always advocated for keeping doors open even when it seemed futile, had always hoped that time and distance might heal wounds that seemed too deep to close. But she had also spent the last few years watching those same wounds get repeatedly torn open, had witnessed her husband's pain every time a new accusation was leveled or a new story was sold to the highest bidder, had felt her own heart break a little more with each betrayal disguised as truth-telling. She thought about her own family, about her parents and siblings who had faced their share of media scrutiny, but had never once sold stories or broken confidences or used their connection to the royal family as currency in the marketplace of public opinion. When Catherine finally spoke, her voice was soft but contained a steel that William recognized as the strength that had carried her through scandals and losses and the relentless pressure of life under constant observation. She told him about Charlotte's questions, about George's confusion, about little Louis, who would grow up barely remembering he even had cousins in America. She spoke about the sleepless nights she had spent wondering if they were being too harsh, too unforgiving, too wrapped up in institutional pride to see the human cost of this endless conflict. But then she talked about her own limits, about the point at which protecting her own children became more important than maintaining relationships that brought nothing but pain and chaos into their carefully constructed lives. William listened as his wife laid out her thoughts with the clarity and precision that had made her one of the monarchy's greatest assets, and when she finished speaking, he realized that she was not trying to talk him out of his decision, but rather giving him permission to do what needed to be done. Catherine's quiet agreement, given after days of her own private wrestling with the moral complexities of cutting off family, felt like the final piece falling into place. The last confirmation that this was not cruelty but necessity. The king's reluctant blessing. King Charles III had spent his entire life waiting to be king, and now that he finally wore the crown he had never imagined, his reign would be defined by such painful family divisions that played out on the world stage like some tragic Shakespeare drama that never seemed to reach its final act. He sat in his study at Buckingham Palace, the same room where his mother had made countless difficult decisions during her 7 decades on the throne, and he wondered what she would have done in his position, whether she would have been stronger or wiser or simply more willing to cut losses when reconciliation seemed impossible. The document William had presented to him lay on the desk like an accusation, each line a reminder of how completely his dream of a united family serving the nation together had crumbled into dust and bitterness. Charles had always been closer to Harry than William in some ways, had understood his younger son's rebellious streak and need for independence because he too had chafed against royal restrictions in his youth, had pushed boundaries and made choices that scandalized the establishment. When Harry had first announced his intention to step back from royal duties, Charles had tried to be understanding, had wanted to find some middle ground where his son could have both freedom and family, where the institution could bend without breaking. But the years since had taught him that some compromises were impossible, that you could not be half in and half out of an institution that demanded total commitment, that the Sussexes wanted all the benefits of royal status without any of the responsibilities that came with it. The king read through William's proposal for the 3rd time that week, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he absorbed the full scope of what his eldest son was requesting permission to implement. Every counselor of state position revoked, every patronage reassigned, every military appointment terminated, every privilege connected to their former status as working royals systematically dismantled until nothing remained but the bare facts of bloodline and inheritance that could not be erased by any decree or decision. Part of Charles wanted to refuse, wanted to insist that there must be another way, wanted to believe that time would heal what seemed irreparably broken. But he was not just a father anymore, he was a king, and kings had to think beyond their personal feelings to consider what was best for the institution that would outlive them all. His private secretary had laid out the arguments on both sides with characteristic thoroughness, presenting the case for mercy alongside the case for firm boundaries, giving Charles all the information he needed to make an informed decision, while carefully avoiding any hint of personal opinion. The arguments for William's proposal were compelling in their stark practicality. The Sussexes had chosen their path, and this was simply the logical conclusion of choices they had made freely and repeatedly defended in public forums. They had wanted independence, and now they would have complete independence, severed from the institution they had criticized so publicly and so profitably. The arguments against were equally powerful in their emotional weight. This was still his son, still his grandchildren, still family despite everything that had happened, and closing every door felt like admitting failure as both a father and a peacemaker. Charles thought about the grandchildren he barely knew, Archie and Lilibet growing up in California sunshine with almost no connection to their heritage or their extended family, and he felt a deep sadness that had nothing to do with protocols or privileges and everything to do with lost opportunities for relationships that might have enriched everyone's lives. But he also thought about William's children, about the confusion and hurt they experienced every time their father was attacked in the press by their own uncle, about the message it sent to them if the institution failed to protect itself and its future from those who seemed intent on destruction from a safe distance. In the end, Charles signed the documents because he was a king before he was a father, because duty had to triumph over sentiment, because William would one day sit where he sat now and deserved the full support of the crown in managing threats both external and internal. His signature felt heavy as he wrote it, each letter formed with the knowledge that this would likely be the final chapter in a family drama that had brought him nothing but heartache, but he signed it nonetheless because that was what being king demanded. Montecito receives the news. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. The royal seal on the heavy cream paper should have been a warning, but somehow they had convinced themselves that the worst was already behind them, that they had weathered the storms and come out stronger on the other side, that their new life was secure and untouchable by the family they had left behind. The courier who delivered it wore an expression of careful neutrality, handed over the document without ceremony, and disappeared back down the long driveway lined with palm trees and security cameras that were supposed to keep the world at bay. Inside the house that had cost millions and represented their declaration of independence from royal constraints, they opened the envelope together with hands that trembled slightly despite their best efforts to appear calm and unbothered. The language was formal and diplomatic, wrapped in the kind of official phrasing that royal communications had perfected over centuries, but the meaning was impossible to misunderstand even through all the polite words and careful legal terminology. One by one, the document listed everything being taken away, every title and patronage and privilege and connection being severed with the precision of a surgeon removing diseased tissue from an otherwise healthy body. They had known this might come eventually, had discussed the possibility during late-night conversations when the children were asleep and the weight of their decisions pressed down on them like the California heat that never quite broke even after sunset. But knowing something might happen was different from holding the official notice in your hands, from seeing your name struck through with bureaucratic efficiency, from understanding that every bridge back to the life you had known was now completely and permanently destroyed. The Counselor of State status gone, the military appointments terminated, the patronages reassigned to other members of the family who had stayed and served and never complained about the price of duty. What hurt most was not the loss of the titles themselves, but what they represented, the final confirmation that the family had given up on them, that William had turned his back completely, that even Charles, with all his talk of love and understanding, had signed off on this comprehensive dismantling of their remaining royal identity. They had wanted freedom, and now they had it in its purest and most isolating form, cut loose from the institution not by their own choice this time, but by decree from the very people who were supposed to love them unconditionally. The irony was sharp as broken glass. They had fought so hard to escape the suffocating constraints of royal life, only to discover that being pushed out entirely felt worse than any restriction they had endured while still inside the palace walls. The document made clear that this was final, that there would be no appeals or reconsideration, that the decision had been made at the highest levels and implemented with the full authority of the crown. Outside their window, the Pacific Ocean stretched toward the horizon, beautiful and vast and utterly indifferent to their pain, a reminder that they had chosen this distance and now distance was all they had left. The public announcement. Buckingham Palace released the statement at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning London time, calculated to hit the morning news cycle in Britain while Americans were still sleeping and dreaming their way through the California night. The words had been crafted over days of careful revision by communications experts who understood that every syllable would be analyzed and debated and turned into headlines around the world within minutes of publication. The tone was deliberately administrative, stripped of emotion or commentary, presenting the changes as nothing more than a routine reallocation of royal duties and responsibilities in light of current working arrangements and the evolving structure of the modern monarchy. But the British press corps, who had covered the royal family for decades, could read between every carefully placed line, could see the significance in what was not being said as clearly as in the words actually chosen. Within 30 minutes of the announcement, the first breaking news alerts were pinging on phones across the United Kingdom, the headlines growing more dramatic with each passing hour, as editors competed to capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. The BBC led with restrained language about restructuring and reassignments, while the tabloids screamed about exile and betrayal and the final devastating blow in a war that had raged for years across continents and media platforms. Royal commentators were dragged from their breakfast tables and morning routines to appear on television programs, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced solemnity, as they explained the implications of the announcement to audiences who were hungry for drama and intrigue. Some praised the decision as long overdue, arguing that the palace had been too lenient for too long with family members who wanted the prestige of royal status without the actual work that came with it. Others expressed concern about the optics of such a harsh and public severance, wondering aloud whether this made the monarchy look petty and vindictive, whether King Charles and Prince William had overreached in their efforts to draw clear boundaries. The statement itself mentioned no names directly, but everyone knew exactly who was being referenced when it discussed the reallocation of patronages previously held by non-working members of the royal family residing overseas. The careful legal language could not disguise the personal nature of what was happening, could not hide the fact that this was a family tearing itself apart in full view of a fascinated global audience that had been following every twist and turn of the Sussex saga since the beginning. Social media exploded with opinions divided along predictable lines. Sussex supporters declaring this proof of institutional cruelty, while monarchy defenders insisted that actions had consequences and nobody could expect royal privileges while living in American luxury and selling family secrets. Foreign press picked up the story with varying degrees of understanding about British constitutional matters, American outlets in particular, struggling to explain the significance of titles and patronages to audiences who had no frame of reference for hereditary monarchy or the intricate web of duties and expectations that came with it. But they all understood family drama, all recognized the universal story of relationships broken beyond repair. All saw the tragedy in brothers who had once been close, now separated by an ocean, and decisions that could never be undone. The announcement that was meant to sound routine and administrative had instead become confirmation of what everyone had suspected. The fairy tale was over, and there would be no reconciliation scene before the final credits rolled. Allies and enemies. The announcement sent shockwaves through the interconnected world of British aristocracy and royal circles, where everyone had an opinion, and nobody could resist sharing it over afternoon tea and carefully worded text messages that would never be shown to journalists but somehow always found their way into gossip columns anyway. In drawing rooms across London and country estates scattered throughout the English countryside, members of the extended royal family gathered in small groups to discuss what had happened and what it meant for the future of an institution that suddenly seemed more fragile than anyone had wanted to admit. Some breathed audible sighs of relief that firm boundaries had finally been established after years of watching the Sussexes criticize and profit from their royal connections, while refusing to actually do any of the work that came with those privileges. Princess Anne had never been one for diplomatic silence, and she made her position clear to anyone who asked and several people who had not, declaring that loyalty to the crown meant showing up and doing your duty, not selling stories from a mansion in California. The Duke of Edinburgh quietly supported his brother-in-law's decision, understanding that sometimes being kind meant being firm, that protecting the institution for future generations required making difficult choices that would be unpopular in certain circles. But not everyone in the family was convinced that such a dramatic and public severing had been necessary or wise. Some of the older cousins whispered their concerns about how this would look to a younger generation that valued family bonds over institutional loyalty. Across the Atlantic, in the celebrity circles that had embraced the Sussexes as brave truth-tellers who had escaped a toxic system, the response was immediate and fierce, and completely predictable to anyone who had been paying attention. A-list friends took to social media with carefully crafted statements expressing support and outrage in equal measure, framing the palace announcement as proof of everything the Sussexes had been saying all along about institutional cruelty and refusal to modernize. Talk show hosts devoted opening monologues to the story, painting William as a villain and the Sussexes as victims of a family that could not accept their desire for independence and happiness on their own terms. The battle lines that had been drawn years ago only deepened and hardened as both sides retreated further into their respective echo chambers, where everyone agreed with everyone else, and dissenting voices were dismissed as either brainwashed royalists or celebrity-worshipping Americans who did not understand British tradition. In Britain, the tabloids ran polls showing public opinion split almost exactly down the middle. Half the country believing the Sussexes had brought this on themselves through years of public attacks on the family, while the other half saw the palace as vindictive and unable to forgive people who had simply wanted to live life differently. The younger generation seemed more sympathetic to the Sussex position, while older Britons tended to side with the institution and its need to protect itself from those who would damage it from within. Behind the scenes, political figures tried to stay out of what they correctly identified as a family matter that could only damage anyone foolish enough to take sides publicly, but even they could not completely avoid the gravitational pull of a story that had captured global attention. The palace machinery continued its work with professional efficiency, reassigning patronages and updating official documents while pretending not to notice the chaos swirling around every decision they made. The children caught between. In the nursery at Kensington Palace, where 3 children were growing up under the constant watch of nannies and protection officers and parents who tried desperately to give them something resembling normal childhood experiences, Prince George asked his mother a question that broke her heart, even though she had been expecting it for weeks. The young prince wanted to know why his cousins in America never came to visit anymore, why they could not all play together like other families did, why the adults always got quiet and changed the subject whenever he mentioned Archie and Lilibet by name. Charlotte listened from her corner where she was supposed to be doing homework but was really paying attention to every word, her young mind trying to make sense of adult problems that nobody would explain properly because they thought she was too young to understand. Catherine sat down on the floor beside her eldest son, ignoring the palace protocol that said princesses should not sit on nursery floors, and tried to find words that would be honest without being hurtful or placing blame on people who were still family even if they felt like strangers now. She explained that sometimes people make choices that take them far away, that distance makes relationships harder to maintain, that adults sometimes disagree about important things, and those disagreements create space between families that used to be close. George listened with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand complicated things, his blue eyes so much like his father's searching her face for answers she could not fully give, without making everything worse than it already was. Little Louis was too young to understand any of it, blessedly ignorant of the family drama that had consumed the adults around him since before he was even born. But George and Charlotte were old enough to notice the absence of relatives they barely remembered, old enough to see photographs of themselves as babies with an uncle who never visited anymore. They would grow up with fragmented memories of family gatherings that had stopped happening, of adults who smiled in old pictures, but now lived on the other side of the world, and never sent birthday cards or Christmas presents, or any acknowledgement that their British cousins even existed. Across the ocean in the Montecito mansion, where American sunshine poured through floor-to-ceiling windows and the sound of the Pacific provided constant background music to daily life, Archie and Lilibet were growing up with even less connection to the family and country that should have been half their heritage. They were American children with British titles that meant nothing in the place they actually lived, with grandparents they saw on video calls if they saw them at all, with cousins whose names they knew but whose faces were fading from memory with each passing month. Their parents tried to explain their heritage in terms that made sense to children who had never walked through palace halls or understood what it meant to be royal in a place that had abolished royalty centuries ago. The real tragedy was not in the titles being stripped away, or the patronages being reassigned, or any of the administrative details that dominated headlines. The real tragedy was in a generation of children who would never know each other properly, who would grow up as strangers, separated by choices their parents had made and consequences that would echo through their entire lives. Family trees that should have included memories of shared holidays and cousin adventures would instead have blank spaces and awkward silences where relationships should have been. No path back. The intermediaries who had spent years shuttling carefully worded messages between London and Montecito, who had facilitated awkward video calls on birthdays and attempted to broker peace during the rare moments when both sides seemed willing to compromise, suddenly found themselves without purpose or employment in a conflict that no longer had any interest in mediation. These trusted advisors and family friends who had genuinely believed that time and patience might heal wounds that seemed impossibly deep were forced to accept that their services were no longer required, that the bridges they had tried so hard to maintain had finally collapsed under the weight of too many grievances and too little goodwill from either side. The few remaining channels of communication that had existed even during the worst periods of tension fell silent in the weeks following the announcement. Phone numbers were changed without the new ones being shared. Email addresses went unanswered as messages bounced back with automated responses that felt colder than any angry words could have been. What little contact had existed between the two households evaporated like morning fog under harsh sunlight, leaving behind only the stark reality that there was simply nothing left to say that had not already been said 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways with 1,000 different outcomes that all led to the same place of mutual resentment and permanent separation. Legal experts hired by both sides to review the palace decisions confirmed what the families already knew in their hearts, even if they were not ready to admit it out loud. The changes were binding and comprehensive, and had been implemented with such thoroughness that reversing them would require not just apologies or gestures of reconciliation, but a complete transformation of circumstances that seemed impossible to imagine. The Sussexes would need to return to Britain permanently, would need to resume full-time royal duties, would need to rebuild trust that had been shattered into fragments too small to ever properly reassemble. The palace would need to forgive years of public criticism and private betrayals, would need to ignore the books and interviews and documentaries that had painted them as villains in a story that had captivated millions. Neither side showed any indication of being willing to take even the smallest step toward compromise. Both had dug into positions that felt righteous and justified from their respective viewpoints. Both believed they were the wronged party in a conflict where assigning blame had become more important than finding solutions. The Sussex supporters pointed to the lack of support and understanding they had received from an institution that valued tradition over individual happiness. The palace defenders emphasized the repeated breaches of trust and protocol by people who wanted freedom, but also wanted to keep all the benefits that came with royal status. What had begun as a bid for independence and a chance to escape the suffocating constraints of royal life had somehow transformed into complete exile, a severing so absolute that even those who had supported the original departure began to question whether this outcome had been intended or desired by anyone involved. The bridges were not just burned anymore, they had been demolished so thoroughly that not even the foundations remained, leaving only empty space where connections used to exist, and silence where conversation used to flow. Two houses, forever divided. The months that followed the final break settled into a new normal that nobody had really wanted, but everyone had to accept because there were no other options left on the table after all the decisions had been made and all the consequences had played out to their inevitable conclusion. In Britain, the Wales family moved forward with their royal duties with a renewed sense of purpose, appearing at charity events and state dinners and community gatherings with smiles that looked genuine enough to satisfy the cameras, even if the people wearing them carried private sadnesses they would never discuss in public. William and Catherine threw themselves into their work with the kind of dedication that won praise from commentators who had once worried they were too modern and casual to properly represent the crown. Prince George began attending more official functions, learning the protocols and expectations that would one day define his entire existence, while Charlotte and Louis grew up understanding that duty came before personal preference and family loyalty meant protecting the institution, even when it cost you relationships you might have valued. The Wales children would inherit a monarchy that had been tested and had survived, but they would also inherit the knowledge that even blood ties could be broken when values diverged too dramatically, and when pride prevented the kind of humility that reconciliation always required from everyone involved. Across the Atlantic Ocean in their California sanctuary, where palm trees swayed in ocean breezes, and the weather was always perfect in that way that only carefully curated lifestyles could achieve, the Sussexes built their separate empire piece by piece with the same determination they had once applied to escaping royal constraints. They signed deals with streaming platforms and publishers, launched charitable ventures that reflected their values and interests, appeared at events where they were celebrated as brave iconoclasts who had chosen authenticity over obligation. Their children grew up American in every way that mattered, attending local schools and playing with neighborhood kids and experiencing childhoods that were privileged, but fundamentally different from the gilded cage that palace life would have required. Both families posted carefully curated images on social media and gave occasional interviews that painted their respective choices in the best possible light. Both insisted they were happy and fulfilled and had no regrets about the paths they had chosen, even as the subtext of everything they said suggested wounds that had not quite healed despite all the time and distance. They lived parallel lives that never intersected, celebrated holidays on different continents, marked milestones without acknowledgement from the people who should have been part of those moments, but were not because choices had been made and prices had been paid. History would eventually judge who had been right and who had been wrong in this family drama that had played out on the global stage. Future generations would analyze the decisions and debate whether reconciliation had ever been possible or whether the ending had been written from the very beginning. But for now, there was only the reality of two households separated by an ocean and by grievances that had hardened into permanent barriers. Two brothers who had once been close enough to finish each other's sentences, now living entirely separate existences, with no contact and no prospect of ever finding their way back to each other through the walls they had built. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.